We know how the story ends. In 1177 BC, the great powers of the Bronze Age crumbled. Empires vanished. Cities burned. The world went dark. But here is what we rarely ask: what exactly was lost? What kind of world existed before the apocalypse? It was not a world of primitive tribes and isolated villages. It was a globalized civilization. Connected, sophisticated, fragile, and in many ways, more advanced than anything that would follow for centuries. This is the world before the collapse. Imagine a world where the Pharaoh of Egypt wrote personal letters to the king of the Hittites, where they called each other brother, where royal daughters traveled thousands of kilometers to become queens in foreign lands, binding empires together by marriage and diplomacy. This was the Late Bronze Age, the 14th and 13th centuries BC, a period of unprecedented internationalism. We know this because of one extraordinary archaeological discovery, the Amarna Letters. Over 300 clay tablets, found in Egypt, containing the actual correspondence between rulers. Not myths. Not legends. Real diplomatic mail. The king of Elashia, that Cyprus, sends copper and timber to Egypt. The king of Babylon complains that the pharaoh's gift of gold was insufficient. The king of Assyria insists on being recognized as an equal. These were not mere traders. These were monarchs managing a complex web of alliances, trade routes, and obligations. A true international system. When the Hittite king Hattusili III wrote to the Egyptian pharaoh Rameses II, he was not just negotiating peace. He was managing a relationship between two superpowers who understood that their prosperity depended on stability. This was a world that had rules. Protocol. A shared understanding of how great powers should behave. At the western edge of this world stood Egypt, the new kingdom. Wealthy, militarized, ancient. Under pharaohs like Seti I and Rameses II, Egypt projected power deep into Canaan and Syria. But Egypt was more than an army. It was a bureaucratic machine. Granaries. Treasuries. A priesthood that managed the economy of the gods themselves. To the north, in Anatolia, rose the Hittite Empire. A warrior society built on iron discipline, though they still fought in bronze. The Hittites controlled the trade in iron, rare, precious, almost magical in this age. Their capital, Hattusa, was a fortress of temples and palaces, carved into the rocky plateau. Between these giants lay smaller but vital powers. Mitanni, once mighty, now absorbed into the Hittite sphere. Assyria, rising quietly in the east, watching and waiting. And to the west, across the Aegean, the Mycenaean Greeks. Not the classical Greece of Athens and Sparta. Something earlier. Something stranger. Citadels on hills. Treasure-filled tombs. A warrior aristocracy who buried their dead with golden masks and bronze weapons. They traded olive oil, wool, and wine across the Mediterranean. These were not separate worlds. They were nodes in a single network. The glue that held this world together was trade. Not luxury trade alone. Essential trade. The kind that determines whether a civilization lives or dies. Bronze requires two things: copper, which was abundant, and tin, which was not. Tin came from distant mines, perhaps Afghanistan, perhaps Cornwall, perhaps the Taurus Mountains. Without tin, there is no bronze. Without bronze, there are no swords, no armor, no tools, no status. This tin traveled thousands of kilometers. From the mines to the rivers, from the rivers to the ports, from the ports across the Mediterranean. Every hand that touched it added value. Every border crossed required negotiation, protection, trust. Copper came from Cyprus, Elashia, whose kings became rich supplying the great powers. Their copper was the blood in the veins of the Bronze Age economy. And it moved by sea. The Mediterranean was not a barrier. It was a highway. Ugarit, in modern Syria, was one of the great ports of this age. A commercial city where Egyptian, Hittite, Mycenaean, and Canaanite merchants did business side by side. We know the names of some of these merchants from the tablets found in Ugarit. They operated like medieval banking houses, issuing letters of credit, managing international accounts, financing expeditions. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Amber from the Baltic. Ivory and ebony from Nubia. Gold from Egypt. Papyrus, grain, wine, wool, spices, incense. The palaces of this age were not just residencies. They were economic command centers. They stored, redistributed, and controlled the flow of wealth. And everything was written down. Every transaction. Every shipment. Every debt. The Bronze Age was a civilization of paperwork. But what was it like to live in this world? Not as a king or a merchant, but as a person? Cities like Ugarit, Hattusa, Thebes, and Mycenae were cosmopolitan centers. A craftsman in Ugarit might use Mycenaean pottery techniques, wear Egyptian beads, and worship gods with Hittite names. Textiles were a major industry. Wool from the highlands, linen from the Nile Valley, dyed with pigments traded from across the known world. The diet was surprisingly varied. Grain, of course, barley and emmer wheat. But also olives, grapes, figs, dates, fish from the sea and rivers, cheese, beer, and wine. We even have records of taverns in Ugarit. Places where ordinary people gathered, drank, and complained about prices, just like today. Religion was everywhere. Not separate from daily life, but woven into it. The same gods traveled across borders. Bull, the storm god, was worshipped in Canaan and in Hittite lands. Ishtar became a start. Religious ideas moved with the merchants. For the elite, life was spectacular. Palaces with frescoes and running water. Banquets with musicians and dancers. Clothing of the finest wool, dyed in royal purple from sea snails. For the warrior class, status was displayed in bronze. The quality of your armor, the decoration on your sword, the number of chariots you commanded, these defined your place in society. The great military innovation of this age was the chariot. Light, fast, pulled by 2 horses, carrying a driver and an archer. Chariots were the tanks of the Bronze Age. Expensive, terrifying, decisive in battle. But they required an entire supply chain, horses from the steppe, wood from the forests, bronze for the fittings, trained crews. Bronze itself was a marvel. An alloy of copper and tin that could be cast into complex shapes, sharpened to a deadly edge, and decorated with exquisite art. A Mycenaean dagger might take weeks to make. The bronze blade, the gold inlay, the wooden handle wrapped in leather, each component from a different place, each craftsman with years of training. Shipbuilding was another high technology. The Uluburun shipwreck, found off the coast of Turkey, carried 20 tons of cargo from 9 different cultures. It was a floating warehouse, a testament to the sophistication of Bronze Age maritime engineering. When that ship went down around 1300 BC, it was carrying copper, tin, glass, gold, ebony, ivory, resin, ceramics, and weapons. One ship. One voyage. The entire world in a single hull. But behind all this grandeur was something more fundamental: people. Farmers, herders, fishermen. The vast majority of the population. They lived in mud brick houses, worked small plots of land, paid taxes in grain and labor. They rarely traveled more than a few kilometers from their village. But their surplus fed the cities. Their sons became soldiers. Their daughters became servants in palaces. The great monuments of this age, the temples, the palaces, the fortifications, were built by this labor. Not slaves, mostly, but corvée workers fulfilling obligations to their king or their temple. Literacy was rare. Perhaps 1% of the population could read and write. But that 1% ran everything. They were the administrators, the diplomats, the priests, the merchants. They were also the doctors, the astronomers, the engineers. The Hittites had medical texts describing treatments for wounds and diseases. The Egyptians performed complex surgeries. These were not ignorant people. So this was the world before the collapse. connected, prosperous, complex, but also, and this is crucial, fragile. It depended on a stable climate. A few years of drought could trigger famine, migration, and war. It depended on distant mines continuing to produce tin and copper. If the tin stopped flowing, the bronze stopped flowing. And without bronze, this civilization had no tools, no weapons, no currency. It depended on the sea remaining open. Piracy, war, or simple bad luck could sever a trade route that had functioned for centuries. And it depended on the great powers trusting each other. When Egypt and the Hittites fought at Kadesh, the entire system shuddered. When Assyria grew ambitious, everyone watched their borders. This was not a primitive world that accidentally stumbled into disaster. It was a highly advanced, deeply interconnected civilization that had created a system of such complexity that it could not survive multiple shocks at once. When we look at the collapse of 1177 BC, we often focus on the invaders, the sea peoples, the earthquakes, the drought. But to understand why it mattered, we must understand what was destroyed. A world of diplomats and merchants, of scribes and craftsmen, of queens and warriors. A world where a letter could travel from Thebes to Hattusa. Where a merchant in Ugarit could finance a voyage to Mycenae. Where a princess could become a queen in a land she had never seen. That world died. And when it died, it took centuries of knowledge, connection, and sophistication with it. The Iron Age that followed was not inferior. But it was different. Smaller. More local. Less connected. In the next episode, we will see how the great powers tried to fight back. How the Hittites faced the storm. How the last message was sent. And how, one by one, the lights went out. This was The Past Breathes. Thank you for watching.